I therefore urge Iran to release the Stena Impero and her crew and observe the rules that safeguard commercial shipping and benefit Iran as much as any other country. Iran has tried to present this as a tit-for-tat incident following the government of Gibraltar's action on the 4th of July to enforce EU sanctions by preventing the Iranian chartered tanker Grace 1 from supplying oil to Syria. But there is simply no comparison between Iran's illegal seizure of a vessel inside a recognised shipping lane, where the Stena Impero had every right to be, and the enforcement of EU sanctions against a tanker that had freely navigated into the waters of a British overseas territory. So since the 4th of July, we've made strenuous efforts to resolve the Grace 1 issue. On the 13th of July, I spoke by phone to the Iranian Foreign Minister, Jawad Zarif, and also made clear in public that we would be content with the release of Grace 1 if there were sufficient guarantees the oil would not go to any entities sanctioned by the EU. But instead of responding constructively, Iran chose to seize the Stena Impero. So we must now take appropriate action to support the safe passage of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. As well as speaking again to my Iranian counterpart, I've also spoken this weekend and today to the foreign ministers of Oman, the United States, France, Germany, Italy, Finland, Spain and Denmark. COBRA meetings were held this morning and throughout the weekend, and the chargé d'affaires at the Iranian embassy in London was summoned to the Foreign Office on Saturday to receive a formal protest. I can today update the House on further action we are taking. Firstly, the Department of Transport has raised the security level for British flag shipping to level 3, advising against all passage in Iranian waters and, for the moment, in the entire Strait of Hormuz. Secondly, because freedom of navigation is a vital interest of every nation, we will now seek to put together a European-led maritime protection mission to support safe passage of both crew and cargo in this vital region. We've had constructive discussions with a number of countries in the last 48 hours, and we will discuss later this week the best way to complement this with recent US proposals in this area. The new force will be focused on free navigation, bearing in mind that 1/5 of the world's oil, 1/4 of its liquefied natural gas, and trade worth $500 billion passes through the Strait of Hormuz every year. It will not be part of the US maximum pressure policy on Iran because we remain committed to preserving the Iran nuclear agreement. Thirdly, while we will seek to establish this mission as quickly as possible, the government has in the meantime dispatched HMS Duncan, a Type 45 destroyer, to take over from HMS Montrose, and she will arrive in the region by the 29th of July, a week from today. Fourthly, we'll ask all British flagged ships to give us notice of any intention to pass through the Strait of Hormuz to enable us to offer the best protection we can. We'll then advise them of the safest way to transit, which may involve travelling in convoy. Finally, we're strengthening measures to protect ships flying the flags of other countries, but which have British crew on board. Mr. Speaker, about 1,300 ships appear on the UK ship register. The combined British Red Ensign fleet is the 9th largest in the world, and on an average day, 2 or 3 ships belonging to the Red Ensign group pass through the Strait of Hormuz. The Gulf spans an area of nearly 100,000 square miles. HMS Montrose covers an operating area of some 19,000 nautical miles, and so far has escorted 30 merchant vessels through the strait during 17 separate transits, travelling 4,800 nautical miles in the process. It is, of course, not possible for the Royal Navy to provide escorts for every single ship, or indeed eliminate all risks of piracy. But those risks can be substantially reduced if commercial shipping companies cooperate fully with instructions from the Department of Transport, which we strongly encourage them to do. These changes, both short and medium term, are made possible because of the commitment this government has already made to increase our security presence in the Gulf, including the opening in April last year of the first permanent British naval facility in the Gulf for over 40 years. This establishment in Bahrain now hosts HMS Montrose along with 4 mine countermeasure vessels and 1 supply ship. Finally, let me say that it is with a heavy heart that we are announcing this increased international presence in the Gulf, because the focus of our diplomacy has been on de-escalating tensions in the hope that such changes would not be necessary. We do not seek confrontation with Iran. We've taken every available opportunity to reduce misunderstanding whilst standing by our rock-solid commitment to the international rule of law, which is the foundation of global peace and prosperity. But we must also react to the world around us as it is and not how we would wish it to be. So if Iran continues on this dangerous path, they must accept the price will be a larger Western military presence in the waters along their coastline, not because we wish to increase tensions, but simply because freedom of navigation is a principle which Britain and its allies will always defend. And I commend this statement to the House.
Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Let me start by passing on the apologies of the Shadow Foreign Secretary that she cannot be here to respond herself, but as many will know, she's still at home recovering from the injuries she received after being knocked off her bike on Friday, and I'm sure we will all wish her well. May I also take the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to pay tribute to the outgoing Minister for Europe and the Americas, the Right Honourable Member for Rutland and Melton. He has served the Foreign Office with diligence and distinction in bad times and good, and he certainly can be forgiven for fearing that the bad times are about to return. But we thank him for the spirit in which he engaged in our parliamentary debates, and we look forward to him continuing to make those contributions from the back benches. I'd also like to add that in the unfortunate event that this Foreign Secretary's final appearance in his current role is today, we thank him too for the welcoming change in tone and the very welcome change in work ethic that he's brought to that great office of state, not least on the issue of Iran that we're discussing today. Mr. Speaker, Iran's actions in recent weeks in the Strait of Hormuz have been utterly unacceptable and should be condemned from all sides. Our thoughts, first and foremost, are with the 23 crew members on board the Stena Impero, and of course their families, who are facing this period of concern and uncertainty. And Mr. Speaker, we all know why these events have been taking place, because just like the tanker war in the 1980s, there is a simple and ruthless logic being applied by the Iranian hardliners who are now in the ascendancy in Tehran, just as they were 30 years ago. And it simply says, if you try and stop our oil supplies, we will stop yours. An escalation of tit-for-tat rhetoric and action that has been sadly so predictable and to some extent inevitable since the United States walked away from the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions not limited to the US, but in theory to any company or country that continues to deal with Iran. And I say in theory, Mr. Speaker, because as we all know, those countries like China, powerful enough to ignore the Trump administration's demands, have continued to import oil and gas from Iran while Washington turns a blind eye. But that brings us to the specific issue of the seizure of the Grace 1 oil tanker and the unacceptable retaliatory action that Iran has taken against Stena Impero. We know from the Spanish newspaper El País that the US told the Madrid government 48 hours in advance that Grace 1 was headed for the Iberian Peninsula, which could also explain why, 36 hours in advance, the Gibraltar government introduced new legislation to shore up the legal basis for the seizure taking place in its waters. So may I ask the Foreign Secretary to confirm whether the US was also the source of our information regarding the tanker's course, whether it is correct that they asked us to seize it, and whether their primary basis for that request was the tanker's destination to Syria, or that its origin was Iran. And if it's correct, Mr. Speaker, that we knew full 2 days in advance that this action was going to be taken, Why on earth, a full 17 days later, was a British-flagged tanker left so hopelessly unprotected in the Strait of Hormuz, when anyone with any understanding of this issue could see that this was exactly how the Iranians would respond to the seizure of their own? And when the measures the Foreign Secretary's announced today, which are very welcome, could have been put in place a full 20 days before now, why was the government's eye so patently off the crystal ball? And while I'd like the Foreign Secretary to go into more practical detail about how the government plans to resolve the Grace 1 Stena Impero impasse, we must also address the wider question, which is how to de-escalate the tension with Iran. Stop this tit-for-tat cycle of actions. Get the nuclear deal back on track, and use that as the foundation which it previously promised to be, to address all the other concerns we have about Iran, not least the continued detention of Nazanin Zahawi Ratcliffe and other British dual nationals. So let me close, Mr. Speaker, by asking the Foreign Secretary, setting aside the need to enforce sanctions against the Assad regime, with which we wholeheartedly agree, can he tell us what the government is doing to persuade the Trump administration to drop its sanctions against Iran? Sanctions which breach the international agreement which we, the US, and other countries worked so hard to achieve, and sanctions which have given the hardliners in Tehran the excuse they have always craved to return to the strategy of isolation and aggression, and themselves breach the terms of the nuclear agreement. An agreement which was one of the great diplomatic achievements of this current century, and an agreement, Mr. Speaker, which we must all strive to get back on track before this escalation of tension reaches the point of no return.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, can I say that from this side of the House, we wholeheartedly endorse what the Shadow Foreign Minister said about the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who we wish every success in having a rapid recovery after her very unfortunate bicycle accident. And I think that will be something we all feel on this side of the House. I also want to thank him for his generous comments to me about my time as Foreign Secretary, of course without any sting in the tail, but I particularly want to thank him when he was comparing me to my predecessor for making those comments carefully after 5 o'clock when the leadership contest for the Conservative Party closed, because it might not have helped me in that contest if people thought that he thought that I was a better Foreign Secretary. Can I add my thanks to the brilliant service to British diplomacy made by the Right Honourable Member for Rutland and Melton, who was an outstanding Foreign Office Minister. He will be greatly missed inside King Charles Street, but not for long if tomorrow's result is the upset that I am hoping for. Let me return to the substance of what the Honourable Gentleman said. First of all, on the detention of Grace 1 by the Gibraltar authorities, I want to be absolutely clear that the United Kingdom did not endorse that detention by the Gibraltarian authorities because of a request by the US. We did it because it was transiting oil through the waters of a British overseas territory in contravention of EU sanctions against Syria. And we have been absolutely clear that our issue was the destination of that oil, which is President Assad's regime, because a fundamental objective of British foreign policy has been to make sure that we redraw the international red lines against the use of chemical weapons, which Assad has so tragically broken. So that is the reason, and that is also why we have sought to de-escalate the situation by making it clear to Iran that whatever our disagreements with that regime, we would support the release of that tanker if we could receive guarantees that that oil was not going to Syria. And we made that offer in public as well as in private, so that they would know we were absolutely serious about it. In terms of what we have done since the 4th of July, when that detention happened, there has been a huge amount of work. But let me tell him, on the security side, the Ministry of Defence have been extremely active. They've had officials posted at the Department for Transport, the dispatch of HMS Duncan, the raising of the threat level to level 3, the enhanced activity from HMS Montrose, which has done 17 transits in recent days for 30 vessels, including 16 which had the Red Ensign. 26 hours of helicopter flying by, the Wildcat helicopters. And on the FCO side, we have been doing a huge amount to try and de-escalate the situation, including calls to my Iranian counterpart, my US counterpart Mike Pompeo, the Chief Minister of Gibraltar, who I also met, and attendance at the Foreign Affairs Council on the 15th of July, where I met the French Foreign Minister, amongst many others. So there has been a lot of things that have been happening. But with regard to his substantive point, I think it is important, if we are going to de-escalate this situation, that we do not conflate what happened both in Gibraltar and to the Stena Impero with the JCPOA and the different approach that we have taken to the Trump administration on the Iran nuclear deal. On most foreign policy issues, we are absolutely at one with the United States. We consider them our closest ally, indeed the alliance with the United States, to be the foundation of global peace and prosperity since the Second World War. We do have a difference of opinion on this issue, but we are also absolutely clear that when it comes to freedom of navigation, there can be no compromise, and that is why the solution that we are proposing to the House this afternoon is one that brings in a much broader alliance of countries, including other countries like us that have a different approach to the Iran nuclear deal. But the Iranians must understand that there will be no compromise on freedom of navigation in the Straits of Hormuz. This is absolutely essential for the global economy and for global freedom of navigation, and this country will not blink in that respect.
Mr.